Today we are going to look at Lutheran doctrine from the year 1600 to about 1650. This period of time was known as the period of Orthodoxy. It started with Chemnitz, who we talked about last time. The people that came after Chemnitz and all of the doctrinal disputes that led up to the Formula of Concord, they wanted to make sure they got Lutheran doctrine right. And so what started under Chemnitz became much more involved in the people after him. That they would write a lot on Lutheran doctrine. Now this took place mostly in all over Germany. Different people would write at different times. Now most of these names we do not use today. There's only a couple that we even think about. If I said names, you'd probably think, okay, who is Pastor Otten talking about? John Quenstead, he's a name, prominent writer. There are others that are Abraham Kolov. I'm just going to list a few. And the one that most of us know about is John Gerhard. He lived in the 1600s and wrote his doctrinal books. And up until 20 years ago, not much of John Gerhard was translated. Gerhard wrote mostly in Latin, some German, but mostly Latin. And a lot of that was not translated into English. The person who did most of the research and study on this, and he actually did his doctoral dissertations on this, is the late Robert Preuss. He was the president of the Fort Wayne Seminary when I was there in the middle 1990s. He went to the University of Strasbourg and studied what he called post-Reformation doctrine, post-Reformation theology. And he would go through the people of names who wrote these books, the people I've mentioned, and others, about how they actually went about writing about doctrine. Now this was at great length, lengthy books, and trying to cover every single point of doctrine. By the time John Gerhard finishes in the 1650s, it is quite a lengthy work. And when it's being translated today to English, you have topics, the doctrine of man, the doctrine of God. And these are all volumes of Gerhard. These are not small. They are great lengthy. This takes Scripture, the Church Fathers, and puts down every possible way of understanding doctrine. This period of doctrinal discussion in Lutheranism did lead to what we call the golden age of Lutheranism, or the high age of doctrine. At the same time, this also led to other problems. If you know German history, and I know in the history book that we've been reading in class, this is where what is called the War of the Roses, or the 30 Years' War, is talked about. This is the war that went on in Germany from 1608 to 1648 and was settled with what is known as the Treaty of Westphalia. Westphalia is a town in Germany where they came together and said, okay, we're going to stop arguing and fighting over doctrine. Also during this time, a lot of the doctrines that the Roman Catholics and others church bodies had was in argument. Now, in the same time, and we'll talk about this in the next short video I'm going to do, about this period of Lutheranism, they're so worried about doctrine, they don't think about practice. If we're arguing about doctrine, how do people use that every day? Do they get in a fight with their neighbor, or they argue about some point in doctrine and not actually go about thinking about what I'm supposed to do as a whole with doctrine? And that is what brings the downfall of this period of time. That you worry about doctrine, that you don't actually say, how does it use it in day-to-day life? If you go on and on about the finer points of doctrine, and you can still argue these to this day, but you don't actually put them into practice, that can lead to what they called stale Christianity. I don't know if stale would be the right word, but they called it dead orthodoxy at the time because it was perfectly good, sound doctrine. So you had the right way to worship God, but at the same time, you didn't do anything in life. And by the end, that's what this period of time got labeled as, the period of dead orthodoxy. And so when Gerhard finishes writing his doctrinal books, it isn't very well received because people are saying, you're so worried about doctrine, you're not doing anything else. Also at this period of time, the history of Germany is not that good. You have the War of the Roses, and you also have the plagues coming through. And the plagues would wipe out anywhere from 20 to 35% of the population, and you just went through the War of the Roses. So Germany lost a lot of population. So by the end of the period we call dead orthodoxy, you really have them being set aside. And that's probably how come a lot of those people I mentioned, Quenstedt, Kalov, Christaeus, Gerhard, Hunius, and so forth, weren't translated into another language because they're so worried about doctrine that we didn't need to know this. And so it's not surprising that we don't know too much about this period of Lutheranism when they went arguing about doctrine. And also after this period, 400 years later roughly, most of us don't worry about this because all of the things that were talked about in these doctrinal books were settled when Martin Chemnitz formulated the Book of Concord. That's the book that we is call the standard and norm, rule and norm for the Lutheran faith.